Hello, Art 109. This week's artist is Xiuzhen. Apologies if I'm not pronouncing that well. She was born in Beijing, China, where she still lives today. Studied traditional oil painting, but quickly transitioned to more experimental and conceptual art practices in sculpture, installation, and performance. She uses secondhand or recycled items like clothing and domestic objects to create works that preserve personal memories in a rapidly globalizing and homogenizing world. Let's discuss some of the historical context behind her artwork so that we understand them better. Xiuzhen was influenced by the New Wave movement in China in the 1980s, which refused the social realism aesthetic of the 1960s and 70s Cultural Revolution and prioritized more experimental and conceptual art practices. So if we go back in time to the 60s and 70s, there was a cultural revolution that happened in China. It was a social political movement launched by Mao Zedong, the chairman of the Chinese Communist Party. And during the Cultural Revolution, capitalist and traditional elements of Chinese society were eradicated to preserve communist beliefs in China. During this time, many creative people, artists, writers, poets, musicians, etc., were forced to make work around Communist Party ethics. Those who opposed these efforts could be subject to imprisonment, hard labor, torture, seizure of property, or even death. The reigning artistic style during this time was socialist realism, an idealized representational style that developed in the Soviet Union to depict communist values. And you see examples of that propaganda on this slide. And by the way, you all, artists in China today, when they criticize the Chinese government in any way, they are still in danger and often face consequences. But when you look at these artworks from the Cultural Revolution or CR time period, how are they idealized? Make your own observations for a second. Pause the video if you need. What I'm saying is that everyone is happy, wearing uniform clothing, looking up to leaders. There's no criticism to be found here. It's propaganda for their movement, right? A lot of red. The New Wave movement in the 1980s was an answer to the oppressive elements of the Cultural Revolution of the 60s and 70s. Chinese artists were forced to work almost from scratch because their culture and traditions had been suppressed. They had to work hard to create a new style that brought Chinese art from strict socialist realism to mature, experimental, and conceptual practice in just a few years. So these New Wave artists started to have exhibitions, and the pictures from this slide are from a very significant one in the history of Chinese art, and that is the China Avant-Garde exhibition that occurred in Beijing in 1989. The term avant-garde is French and means advanced guard, and refers to art styles that advocate for social change. In the picture you see crossed out U-turn symbols, which means don't turn your back, come on into the museum and see this new wave. A famous incident that occurred during this exhibition was artist Zhao Lu shot a gun, I think it was a pellet gun, into her installation Dialogue, which was about communication within relationships. In that tiny picture you can maybe make out, there's like a mannequin with a wardrobe on and another one, and then there's a phone in the middle, and then there's the artist aiming the gun. There were no private telephones in China, and to make a personal call, one had to find the public telephone in the street. So the work is called Dialogue. It was about this sort of miscommunication that was happening, maybe not in the best relationship in her personal life, but I believe at the opening of this exhibition, she shot a gun into her installation, and so the exhibition was temporarily shut down. The artist describes jumping on a bus because chaos sort of ensued, riding the bus for a few hours until the crowd went away, and then going and turning yourself in and spending, I believe, 4 days maybe in jail. But it's this incident, along with others, and other works of art, avant-garde artworks that kind of have made this exhibition infamous in the history of Chinese art. But another interesting fact about this is 4 months later, the Tiananmen incident took place in Beijing. You may recognize that infamous picture here on the slide of the man standing in front of the line of tanks. But this work, Dialogue, became known as the first gunshots of Tiananmen. So how do these cultural moments impact our artist? She says the CR, once again the abbreviation for Cultural Revolution, created more hardships and bitterness and regret for the generation before us. It left me, young and naive, with memories of ideals, magnificence, collectivity, creating contradictions and conflicts between isolation and openness, dictatorship and democracy, became a new motivation, and as rapid changes cultivated in me an attitude of calm and quiet. What she's referring to here is the promise of communism in China, what they said it would be versus what it was actually like and what it turned into. So in her work, you're going to see a use of various mediums such as fabric, found objects, and concrete, which add to the tactile interest and depth to her politically and socially charged works. She incorporates used textiles and keepsakes from her childhood in Beijing to show the connection between memory and cultural identity. With these artworks, Xiuzhen solidified her position as a female master in experimental avant-garde art, which was dominated by male artists at the time. Remember, our artist is from Beijing and never left, so that history of place is a big theme in her work. Xiuzhen grew up in one of the city's many courtyard houses that were demolished during the urban reconstruction efforts that were conducted in the 1990s. During this time, China embraced globalization and capitalism, and with that continued the attack on tradition, so that they switched focus a little bit. They still really were moving more toward modernization. So during this time, many traditional homes were removed to make room for gleaming high-rises and new infrastructures. Sensitively reflecting on the transformations around her, she produced a number of installations that incorporated the forgotten remnants of such destruction. So pictured here is our artist collecting tiles from a construction site and then installing them as artworks. As the homes of ordinary people were destroyed, so were the memories, culture, and history they had accrued, sometimes over centuries, as communities were forced to pick up their broken lives on the periphery of the city. Her work, Ruined City, reflects the brutal indifference of Chinese modernization. It features bed frames, dressing tables, wardrobes, and other humble items of furniture covered in cement powder. The materials were taken from actual demolished homes or borrowed from family and friends. The powder taken from a construction site and returned after the exhibition closed. It ran for just a few days, but this installation helped seal Xiuzhen's reputation as an artist. This is another photo to show you how large scale this installation was. You can see all the tiles collected there. For another work called Transformation, Xiuzhen collected 128 cement roof tiles from the thousands that were discarded after the demolition of the homes in her Beijing neighborhood. On each tile, she affixed a photograph documenting the vibrancy of the neighborhood, or the demolition of it, and its changing character, the process. For Xiuzhen, these unconventional materials embodied the memories of a place and time period that was rapidly disappearing. She has explained this process, stating, "When you take the rubble directly into the works, these materials, with their experiences and histories, speak for themselves. They have individual and collective memories as well as many traces of life. When these materials emerge in a different environment, a vein between true reality and the artwork forms. It formalizes real life and allows objects to speak, to have their own voice." So an artist can use any material to represent a message, thought, or idea. But it was important to our artists to go to the construction site and actually use the tiles, the materials, the rubble from the sites in their artwork, because as she just explained, she wanted them to speak for themselves and wanted her artwork to represent truth, for there to be more truth to the artwork. Here's a close-up so you can see the photograph. This is an example of one of the tiles. So this is a photograph of the actual site where the rubble was taken from. Then the artist affixed the image to the tile. Very impactful. Our artist also works with textiles and fiber, and she explores the human connection with cloth. In this piece, a pile of women's sweaters on the left lies on the floor next to a pile of men's sweaters on the right. A horizontal scaffolding of knitting needles between the two piles suggests connection, but also a measure of distance between these everyday items of normative gender difference. Meaning, our clothes often is often a distinguishing factor between the two genders, right? So Xiuzhen has unraveled the sweaters on top of each pile, producing unruly mounds of yarn that a pair of needles has begun to knit and purl together into a single garment, essentially questioning the gender binary. Next up, we're going to see the artist create pieces within suitcases in a series called Portable Cities. This is the first one she did and includes her and her family's clothing and represents Beijing. It started as a more personal piece but grew into a new series that featured other cities. The suitcase lies open to reveal frame-supported fabric cut and engineered to resemble architectural elements of the Chinese cityscape. The small, rumpled, and soft structures interject the modern city with the domestic intimacy of human wear and dwelling. So if you do think about that, right, like cold metal structures and then the organic soft cloth, it's an interesting pairing. Made from clothing once worn by the artist and her family members, the piece represents Beijing as a ring of buildings circling the open green space of a stretched shirt. Pulled inward, the sleeve leads the viewer's eye down to a macro lens that displays in miniature a map of the city, circa 1949, affixed to the bottom of the suitcase. A speaker inside plays Beijing opera, sung by elderly amateurs, recorded in a popular public space north of the Forbidden City, that by 2001 had been modernized with trendy and touristy businesses and attractions. Our artist remembers what it was like before and invites the viewer to explore that. So you see this open suitcase. It has these little structures that resemble the city, and you can kind of hear some music, some opera being sung. It's very quiet, so you have to kind of lean forward and lean over into the suitcase to hear more. And that's when you see this little lens with the old school map from 1949. From there, Xiuzhen did other cities and says that she was inspired to use suitcases by being at the airport and seeing them on the conveyor belt at baggage claim. Her assembled materials operate as sculptural documents of memory, alluding to the lives of individuals, right, one suitcase, who were often neglected in the drive toward rapid development, excessive urbanization, and the growing global economy. She uses old clothing as a human second skin, as new agent to her body that captures common experience of daily life. Here's a monochromatic cityscape using the color blue here. She could be using one color to demonstrate how homogenized the city has become. This is busy New York City and foggy San Francisco. On the left, the Twin Towers are poignantly being featured with a transparent fabric as they are no longer there. So she did her project after the Twin Towers were demolished in the terrorist attack on September 11th, 2001. This is perhaps before the new World Trade Tower was built, but I think this is a good way that she handled that. She also did a bookshelf series. Bookshelf number 1 infuses color and used clothing fabric. The sculpted bookshelf and its collection of books works as an analogy to life and experience, in which life is like a bookshelf that collects and carries on stories of our experience like books on a shelf, building up a collection of narratives and remembrance for others to see and to tell. Here's a close-up so you can see how the books are wrapped in clothing. The tags showing are a nice touch. And notice the shelf on the right is also completely covered. So how do books being wrapped in clothing change the work rather than just using books? Aesthetically, the way it looks, the different colors, she can control that a bit. Texture-wise, it's also acting as a skin, and it just seems more personal and organic and human and alive as it sits there on the shelf. Here's another. Now we're getting into her more recent work. This is from 2020 to 2021. Dongzai Festival is a part of Xiuzhen's ongoing experiment with porcelain as material. Closely associated with Chinese history and tradition, porcelain has been the focus of Yin's practice in recent years. Through a non-traditional method of porcelain firing in her wall instrument series, Xiuzhen realizes subtle yet abundant variation in color and texture on the work surfaces, while also allowing the spontaneity of this firing process to serve as a form of stimulation and dialogue. So you all, ceramics, you would build a pot or a cup or a bowl, and then you're going to have to put it into a kiln to be fired. That means, you're going to have to approach that material with high heat in order to fire it and stabilize it. That way you can drink out of it, right? And you can reuse it and wash it. So this is a similar process where she's putting the porcelain into this non-traditional method of firing. And then what happens are these really great spontaneous effects. Here's another. So ultimately, through this firing process, the original smooth porcelain plates, they take on natural undulations, wrinkles, and cracks. And within these pieces, the artist embeds fragments of worn clothes so that parts of the clothing appear in the porcelain surfaces. In encompassing the experiences of those who wore these clothes, the works mimic biological skin, creating psychological cues and evoking sensory perception from the viewers while acting as poignant carriers of memories. This work was inspired by the emergency instructions she saw on a plane and that interesting feeling she felt. Trojan features a giant woman dressed in clothed fabric sitting in a giant airline seat. The seat is also made of discarded clothes, and the woman is bent over in a pose that we know to be the one that prepares a passenger for a plane crash. There's a few ways to interpret and analyze this piece, but World Architecture comments that Xiuzhen's installation reflects the excessive development, consumption, and globalization that largely defined post-1989 China. The artist deeply focuses attention on threats to a population from one machine, be it of present or ancient times, which is referencing her title of Trojan horse, right? So airplane as Trojan horse. According to the artist, technology is always a threat to individuals in society. So could airplanes and the airline industry, something that we enjoy as a society, being able to travel to a faraway place very quickly, be a Trojan horse? Is it overall harmful? This is an inside view. Now let's explore the theme of family in her work. This installation emulates a factory floor and had a video component as well. About the work, she says, "When I was little, I visited my mother's factory and saw how the workers were rewarded with these red flags. Of course, those red flags had Chinese characters on them, usually names of the awardee and the institution, but I left my flags blank because I think this is more intriguing. hanging these flags creates a certain association with China's era of economic expansion. So she's questioning the rewards and exploitation associated with labor. And as we know, Chinese labor market, we associate that with Chinese people working long hours for very little in comparison to, America, which you could also criticize, right? So she's questioning that system, the rewards and exploitation. Red flags. Should we be giving red flags, or should we perhaps just be paying people more? Like, the artist continues, for the video essay Sky Patch, I reflected on my mother's past. It was another opportunity to bring her in, so her mother helps her sew on her art projects from time to time, but had not in a while. She says, the first time in many years since I hired my assistants. She's now 80 years old, and she witnessed firsthand China's changes during the 20th and 21st centuries. I tried to trace her footsteps back to her hometown, while my daughter also makes an appearance. I included both of their ages in the end credits to create the impression of 3 generations. The title Sky Patch was inspired by the Chinese mythology of the goddess Nuwa, patching up the sky. I think in every generation there's a sky waiting to be mended, and there are gaps to be filled between parents and children. The work serves as a bond that unifies myself, my daughter, and my mother. So it's interesting to think about perhaps her mother working in a sewing factory, of course creating things for practical use, and perhaps her labor being exploited. And then now her daughter is like a famous artist who is able to recreate that, not for a practical purpose, but for an artistic one, right? For that idea of, sending a message, idea, or feeling about this topic, like a commentary on this topic, which, maybe her mother has a hard time understanding. Like, this is, seemingly for no reason, but there's a big reason why artists do what they do, right? So even attitudes about labor can be passed down from generation to generation, and the artist is seeing herself as a mender and a middle point that questions the past of her mother and the future of her daughter. This artwork is a collaboration between her and her partner, I believe her husband, Song Dong, also an accomplished artist. Her daughter's also going to get in on the fun momentarily, but Xiuzhen and Dong were persuaded to cooperate on an exhibition and decided on the theme of chopsticks. So chopsticks are an essential feature of day-to-day living in Asia, which can also be viewed from many different cultural and philosophical viewpoints. A single chopstick is useless, but a pair has multiple uses. It also can be seen as a symbol of the relationship between husband and wife here, independent but mutually supportive. As Dong explains in a 2011 interview, it was one night while eating dinner that the pair came up with the idea. We looked at our chopsticks and saw how the two become one. I could make one, Xiuzhen could make one, both in secret from the other, and then put them together so they could become one work, and yet we've kept our independence. They used clothes and other personal items that Xiuzhen used in her works, and the battered household furnishings and architectural elements that featured in the works of Song Dong come together into one work. With the chopsticks of light, 2 parallel converging beams set into the night sky. The chopstick series is a lifetime project, says Song, which might one day involve their daughter, which it's going to momentarily. With this series, they have chanced upon the perfect artistic metaphor for a harmonious, functioning relationship in which parity, continuity, and unity are married with freedom, evolution, and self-determination. As Yin says, the essence of it is trust as well as equality and independence. So those are what they value in their relationship. A few more images of their different chopsticks here. Very cool. Once again, Hers represent more of her style, which, she likes those traditional elements, and then his reflect more his style. He's interested in architecture, so you see a lot more of those types of elements in his work, which could be seen in some ways as opposite, and yet they pair together very well and function very well together. During the installation of Chopsticks 3 at Chambers Fine Art in New York in 2011, their 8-year-old at the time, Song, approached her parents and expressed her interest in joining their artistic collaboration. Third Chopstick offers 3 distinct points of view. Taken together, the 3 pieces offer an impressively complex view of contemporary family life. So Xiuzhen chose to depict a dizi, D-I-Z-I, which is a traditional Chinese flute. It's typically made of bamboo and was commonly used in Chinese folk music and was traditionally associated with the common people. The piece simultaneously evokes a beautiful and humble tradition rooted in nature and the noxious environmental consequences of expansion and wealth in contemporary China. His chopstick reflects his interest in fake electronics, which, while making reference to the pervasive presence of cheap knockoff products in Chinese society, also reveals his affinity for good-natured trickery. The chopstick has, at first glance, the appearance of a complicated high-tech device. However, upon closer examination, it becomes hilariously implausible as a functioning object. So her chopstick is on the far left, and it resembles a traditional instrument from China, and then his looks more like a remote control of some kind on the right. And their daughter's is going to be right in the middle. And she modeled her chopstick after a wolf. You see the close-up of the face below? She saved the hair from her shedding dogs to create 2 bands of fur running the length of the sculpture. There are ears attached and drawn on eyes and teeth. Very childlike. The sculpture essentially takes the form of an elongated wolf head. She identifies with wolves because they are inherently social creatures. However, as the only child of parents who both come from large families, she feels like a lone wolf. Alright, that's it for this week.